The president has issued a strong warning to the participants in the Middle East, saying the fighting must stop immediately. So is anybody going to heed him? Probably not. Terry?
Well, the UN Security Council wants an immediate ceasefire as well. President Obama pressuring Israel to stop, but so far there's no end in sight. Chris Mitchell brings us the story.
While diplomatic efforts go on, Israeli combat engineers continue to discover and destroy the vast network of Hamas terror tunnels. Israel sees these tunnels as an enormous threat to its population. One tunnel started from underneath the Wafa hospital in Gaza, and several came from the neighborhood of Sajaiya, the scene of some of the heaviest fighting. In the past 2 weeks, Hamas terrorists made several infiltrations into Israel using these terror tunnels. And Israel announced Hamas prisoners told of a mega terror event planned for the Jewish New Year. About 200 Hamas terrorists plan to kill and kidnap hundreds of Israelis along the Israeli-Gaza border. Hamas says the death toll climbed to more than 1,000 Palestinians. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu laid the blame on Hamas for the deaths.
Hamas is responsible for these civilian deaths. Hamas is not only trying to kill our people, it's sacrificing its own people quite willfully, deliberately, cynically, and horribly. They are using their people as human shields.
So far, more than 40 Israeli soldiers have died in the fighting, and dozens have been wounded. Some of the wounded came here to the Sheba Medical Center in Tel Aviv. They came from the front lines and brought with them stories of intense fighting and how Hamas is using women and children as human shields.
My friends said a terrorist hid behind a little girl and shot at them, and they couldn't fire back because they didn't want to kill the little girl. They waited until one of the group succeeded to kill him. They shot him in the head.
Other soldiers faced terrorists using women as human shields.
And they hesitated, and this hesitation cost some of the soldiers their life, and some of the soldiers they got injured because they were surprised to see the women, and behind them came terrorists with machine guns and they started to fire.
It remains to be seen how far the war will go on, but Israel would like to see the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip as one of the lasting goals of Operation Protective Edge. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Tel Aviv.
Thanks, Chris. What I don't know is the president just playing to the Muslim audience and saying, well, look, I tried to get them to stop, but they didn't, or is he really sincerely going to put pressure on Israel? Israel can't stop this thing. They've got to get rid of those tunnels. They have to get rid of those arms caches that are all over the Gaza area. They have to demilitarize Hamas, and impossible to destroy Hamas. They have to do it. And they can't stop. So for us to be screaming, it's like, you know, spitting into the wind. It's just not a smart thing to do. But they yak on in Washington without realizing the seriousness of the situation as far as Israel. But all the nations of the world are coming against Israel. And the United Nations, I mentioned the General Assembly is a joke, but they have been making resolutions against Israel, talking about genocide. The whole thing is defensible. You have to be able to defend yourself against armed aggression. And that's what Israel is facing. Well, in addition to the fighting in the Middle East, President Obama is facing another foreign policy crisis, the battle between Russia and Ukraine. And some in Congress say the president isn't showing the leadership he should. Here's John Jessup with that story.
Pat, the U.S. is stepping up pressure on Russia and releasing new evidence of direct involvement in the conflict with Ukraine. Satellite images suggest Russian forces have fired rockets across the border. And as Ephraim Graham reports, critics say the U.S. needs to take a harder line against Russia.
These are the satellite images the U.S. State Department has released. The slides highlight blast marks from where rockets were launched on Russian soil. American leaders say it's proof Moscow has been firing rockets across the border and more than 7 miles into eastern Ukraine, aimed directly at Ukrainian military forces.
You've got a Russian government that has made the conscious decision to use its military force inside of another sovereign nation to achieve its objectives. First time, I think, probably since 1939 or so.
With the release of these latest images, a State Department spokesperson says Secretary of State John Kerry has spoken to Russia's foreign minister, urging him to stop the flow of weapons into Ukraine, and he refuses to accept Sergei Lavrov's denial of his country's involvement. Republican leadership says the White House must still do more. Senator Lindsey Graham wants to see even more sanctions on the Russian economy and support to equip and train the Ukrainian military.
You know, I think what we've learned from these changing times that without American leadership, the world disintegrates pretty rapidly. I said last week, America is the glue that holds the free world together. And when you see us missing our AWOL, as President Obama's been, you see fracturing on multiple fronts. Russia is more aggressive, not less.
Ukrainian intelligence officials are also pointing fingers at that aggression, and they blame Russia for the attack that took down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17.
The security service of Ukraine possess enough evidence of terrorists who were sent from Russian Federation, from the territory of Russian Federation. They are in charge for shutdown of the Malaysian airplane.
Ephraim Graham, CBN News.
The crisis with Russia, illegal immigration, and other scandals at home are clearly taking their toll on President Obama's approval ratings. Most Americans now say they would vote for Mitt Romney over President Obama by 53 to 44%, according to a CNN poll. This comes after Gallup reported last week that the president's approval rating had fallen to 39%, with 54% saying they disapprove of how he's handling the job. Pat?
Well, he's in over his head. He's a community organizer from a small district, and suddenly he's been launched in as the leader of the free world. He has no experience in what he's doing, and he likes to make speeches. He's pretty good at making speeches, and he likes to go around campaigning, and he's terrific at fundraising. So he's like checked out. It's like the last couple of years of his administration, he's checked out. He's out having parties and going to golf games and things like that, and raising money. He likes to raise money, and he goes into a very exclusive club and eats a good dinner and makes a pat speech that he's made many times before, and gets congratulated by the faithful, and they write checks for $30,000, and he's very happy, and his party likes him. But the truth is, from what we gather, the indication that a number of Senate races are now competitive for the Republicans, and their chance of retaking the Senate has gone up dramatically because of the fecklessness of our president. John.
Pat, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa has killed nearly 700 people, and now 2 Americans have contracted the disease, including an American doctor from the Christian organization Samaritan's Purse, who recently was infected with the virus.
There are inherent dangers in working with the disease. Dr. Brantley is a victim of that right now, but we are doing everything that we can to keep our staff safe. But the reality is it is a deadly disease, and it is easily spread.
Dr. Kent Brantley of Fort Worth, Texas, had been treating patients in the West African nation of Liberia when he came down with Ebola. Brantley is the group's medical director and began serving in Africa before the outbreak. The 33-year-old is undergoing treatment in an isolation center. A Christian volunteer nurse working with Brantley, Nancy Wrightbull, also tested positive and was listed in stable but serious condition. Doctors say early treatment of Ebola increases the chances of surviving. Pat, the World Health Organization says this is the worst Ebola outbreak on record.
Well, the Ebola, the name comes from a river in Zaire, and I was in Zaire when an outbreak of that stuff took place, and we were sending medical teams and supplies up to a place called Kikwit in Zaire. And the thing that struck me, interestingly enough, and this happens to be true, is that the World Health Organization and the Europeans would not provide the funds for hazmat suits for the native Zairean doctors. We had to pick up the tab for that through Operation Blessing so that those people could treat the sick without fear of themselves being infected. This is deadly stuff, and the idea is it gets into you and then you bleed out. The patient bleeds out from this horrible, it's called hemorrhagic fever, and it is just deadly. And it's one of those things that's spread by the contact. Any kind of fluid from one person to another can cause the contagion to spread. And so this noble doctor and nurse who have caught it, I don't know what cure there is for it. I'm sure there are a few people who survive it, but it's not easy. The fatality rate is enormous. And if it gets, this is the biggest outbreak they've ever had. And it's in Sierra Leone.
Do you remember a number of years ago we had an author on who had written a book called The Hot Zone?
Exactly.
And that book kept me up all night. I mean,
well,
if you want to know about that.
That had to do with some monkeys that got loose from a testing facility, but that's right.
But and it was transferred to people because there's so much air travel in the world today.
That's right.
So one person who's sick gets on a plane, and I mean,
but I was there in an outbreak. I was in Zaire when this stuff was going on, and we were sending aid as fast as we could, flying it to a place that they call Kikwit, where there was an outbreak of Ebola. It is dreadful. So they had something else called Marford, and this is another phase of that, but it's the most deadly. And it's, as I say, it's named after a river in Zaire. That's where they first
the whole
noticed
world, really.
Oh yeah, you get on an airplane with that stuff, and you begin to cough, and they begin to bleed, and all of a sudden they start blood. The whole capillary system breaks down, and people begin to bleed out of their extremities. I mean, all over they're bleeding, and that stuff is so highly contagious. Listen, if it gets started throughout the earth, I mean, we have a catastrophe of major proportions. And speaking of a catastrophe, I want to show you what happened that could have taken our civilization right back to the Stone Age. John.
Pat, that's right. Earth dodged a catastrophe 2 years ago. Scientists say an extreme solar storm, believed to be the most powerful in at least 150 years, barely missed us. As Mark Martin reports, if it had hit the Earth, the results would have been devastating.
July 23, 2012. The sun releases two huge clouds of plasma known as coronal mass ejections, or CMEs. Scientists say they combined their energy into one superstorm, which plowed through the orbit of Earth just a week after the planet had moved through that part of space. In other words, if the solar storm erupted only 7 days earlier, Earth would have taken a direct hit. Daniel Baker of the University of Colorado told colleagues from NASA, if it had hit, we would still be picking up the pieces. I have come away from our recent studies more convinced than ever that Earth and its inhabitants were incredibly fortunate that the 2012 eruption happened when it did. Analysts say a direct hit by an extreme coronal mass ejection, like the one in July 2012, could be catastrophic, leading to widespread power blackouts. In fact, a study by the National Academy of Sciences found the total economic impact could be more than $2 trillion. That's 20 times greater than the cost of Hurricane Katrina. In today's technology-driven world, the solar superstorm could have done serious damage from your home all the way up to space. It could have disrupted spacecraft, satellite communications, GPS, airplane flights, and the power grid, which could have knocked out power from businesses to houses.
Without the electric grid, well, of course, there's no power. There's also no water. There's also no communications, no transportation, no medical care. The financial system would be down. The environmental effects would be catastrophic at a level that we've never seen before.
In addition, it could take years to repair multi-ton transformers. Scientists compared the July 2012 storm to a solar storm called the Carrington Event in 1859. That storm had such an impact on Earth, the so-called Northern Lights could be seen from the equator. And it disrupted the world's telegraph system, even causing fires at some telegraph stations. Comparing the 2012 solar storm to the blast from the sun in 1859, Baker said, the only difference is it missed. Mark Martin, CBN News.
Pat, this might be a good time to plug your book, The End of the Age.
Well, that's right. Well, the end of the age has to do with an asteroid hitting, but you know, this little planet we're on, we love it, and it's beautiful, and it's just a choice place to live, and we're just so grateful that we're living here. But it's a tiny little planet in a relatively small solar system, in a relatively small galaxy, in the midst of a gigantic universe. And we are being bombarded constantly. But this thing from the sun, if it kicks out one of these mass ejections, that if we 1 week difference in the placement of the Earth, and we would have fried everything. $2 trillion worth of damages, and some of those big transformers couldn't have come on for years because they've had the repair bill would have been so, well, not the bill, but the actual work on them would have been so enormous. So we need to always recognize that we are in the hands of Almighty God. Jonathan Edwards preached a sermon some years ago, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And only God is holding us up. And this universe and this world we're in could get hit at any minute by some huge asteroid. It could be what they call an impactor that would take away all of civilization. So if Yellowstone erupted, it would destroy life in America. I mean, there's so many things, and we're in the hands of God. So we need to be in prayer constantly. Lord, protect us from these things that might happen in this strange world in which we live.
Operation Blessing has been on the ground assisting victims of a deadly tornado that struck Virginia's eastern shore last week. A response team has been helping clear out debris and cut down fallen trees around the affected area. The EF1 tornado was small, but left 2 people dead and injured 36 in a very small but tight-knit community.
Having Operation Blessing and other supporters come and help us, it's humbling to have people to help you because you really don't know what to do.
Local people said they were thankful, and Operation Blessing personnel were able to pray with and encourage both the residents and first responders. CBN is helping restore sight to hundreds of people in Guatemala. Through CBN's partnership with Operation Blessing, the Light Mission project has been able to help nearly 300 people suffering from poor eyesight. Many have limited access to medical care or don't earn enough money to pay for surgeries. So for them, CBN is an answer to prayer. These life-transforming surgeries also open up opportunities for CBN to share the gospel with patients and their families. Well, you can find out more about what CBN is doing around the world by logging on to cbn.com/international.